Hi everyone, and we're back with part two of the president's report card. So President Trump and former President Obama go to their third class of the day, which is economic growth. And so you can see this, let's go in here. You can see this little part down here that says quarterly growth rate in real GDP. When we talk about economic growth, what we're really talking about is a change in real GDP. So in this module and in future modules, we're going to be talking about the difference between nominal and real data. But basically, economists need to make sure that the economy itself is actually growing, that we are producing more stuff. It doesn't matter whether that stuff is haircuts or cars, physical things or services, but it can't just be that prices are increasing. So that's why stable prices are so important, because if it's just inflation, we're producing the same stuff, but they cost more, well, it's going to look like your economy is growing when in fact it is not. So let's take a look at that. You can see this is the growth rate in real GDP. You can see very clearly right here where the Great Recession was in 2008 and 2009. Negative growth rate, meaning that our economy was actually shrinking. And so you can see that most growth rate from year to year is going to be taking place between 0 and 5%. Normally, if you could actually have a growth rate of 3%, you are thrilled. And so most of the, gosh, I'm sorry about those hot corners. You can see that these are quarters. So every quarter, you can see that throughout most of Obama's presidency, we had growth, a minor blip there, almost zero growth there, a negative blip there. But most of the growth was positive throughout his presidency. Let's move forward. And you can see some actual numbers with that. From 2013, which is in, the middle of his presidency to the end, again, some fairly standard growth that stays within the trend, some outlying quarters of major growth, some outlying quarters of almost no growth, etc. And you can see that the first two quarters of President Trump have pretty much stayed in line with the trend of what had been happening over the past, 5 to 8 years. So one of the things that stimulates growth is employment. If people have jobs, they are spending money. If people have jobs, the factories are producing things. So job creation, these are thousands of jobs for the average months from January to July. Basically, the first 6 months of the year, the average growth in jobs for the past 5-6 years. And you can see that, we averaged 177,000 jobs a month, 191,000 jobs a month in 2013. You can see the numbers there. A very interesting fact that you should know is that just to keep up with inflation, just to keep up with population growth, we need as a society to produce 150,000 jobs a month. So you can see that in 2012, as we're coming out of that Great Recession, we are just barely keeping up with inflation, with population growth, meaning we need 150,000 jobs anyway to just keep up with the people being born. And so we're just creating a little bit above that. But then, here it's looking good. And again, throughout Trump's presidency so far, those jobs numbers fall in the trend line. One thing that definitely has happened since the election is definitely something that we would call an increase in consumer confidence. People have confidence in the economy, which encourages them to spend, and you can see that while consumer confidence was definitely increasing before the election, it has continued to increase under Trump. So consumers have confidence in the economy. You can make your own assessment on whether that's because of the president or not, but you can. It is undoubted that consumer confidence has increased under President Trump. So go ahead, take a pause on the video, and give President Obama and President Trump their grades for period 3 economic growth. So then they go to lunch and they come back and they're going to their class on the balance of trade, favorable balance of trade. So what do we mean by that? The balance of trade is the value of exports equals the value of imports. And those are variables that we do use in economics, X and M. X minus M is the balance of trade. So if they equal each other, then you have a balance. What do we call it when the value of X is greater than the value of M? Meaning that we have more exports than we have imports. Well, we call that a trade surplus. Okay? And what do we call it when the value of M is greater than the value of X? Okay? So when you import a lot more than you export. We call that the USA. That's just a little joke. It's called a trade deficit, but we have basically been in a trade deficit for as long as I can remember, mostly because we became a net importing country, much more, services within the United States in terms of production. We still, of course, export a ton of things, but we import a whole lot more. When you think about where all your clothes are made, look at your tags: China, Vietnam, Indonesia, all your gadgets made in China. That will cause that trade deficit. So we call that a trade deficit. You can see that the red line is the trade deficit, and from 1960 forward, we pretty much were balanced in terms of trade with the rest of the countries, but starting in the 70s and 80s, we began to generate a trade deficit, and it has gotten significantly worse. It decreased a little bit under President Obama, and now we will see what happens. Trade is a huge issue for President Trump, so if he is true to his word, we should see that trade deficit continue to decrease. So here we have the trade deficit in billions, and you can see that the Obama years, if you're trying to give him a grade, are in blue. That means that the red years are Bush before him and then Clinton. And so again, give him a grade on trade balance. It looks like he improved the trade deficit. Definitely still a deficit, but not as big as it was. There's not a lot of data for President Trump yet. The U.S. trade deficit grew again under Trump in September. And it says here that the U.S. trade deficit widened in September and remained on track in President Donald Trump's first year to exceed the 2016 level. So it looks like the trade deficit is going to increase from where Obama had it in 2016. But again, there are policy lags, and you can definitely see that President Trump's rhetoric of America first, could definitely have an effect. So it will be interesting to watch over the next couple of years to see if that trade deficit, to see if we start exporting a lot more or at least importing a lot less from different countries and see if that trade deficit decreases. So keep your eye on that. So again, looking at the different ways that goods come into the United States. Here's a Japanese shipping company. Here's a Korean shipping company. And here's, of course, China shipping everywhere. It's fairly obvious which country is our #1 trading partner. Yes, it is China. You were correct. Take a look at this for just a moment before we go to their final class. You can see that, you know, China is the #1 trading partner with us, and these numbers mean we import 347, I believe this is in billions, more, 347 billion more from China than we send to China. Okay, so you can see that, you know, we send more stuff to the UK. There's a positive there, but most of the countries we're importing more from them than we're sending to them. And if you look at the world, our trade imbalance is a $734 billion deficit. Okay, and there you go. So we come to the last class of the day, and it is limiting government growth. You know, a good president is going to limit the growth of the government, make it more efficient. Every president, whether they're Democrat or Republican, talks about making the government more efficient. Nobody campaigns on simply hiring more people for the government, except maybe Franklin Roosevelt during the Great Depression, and we're going to talk about that in future modules. Let's see how they did. So this is the annualized growth in federal spending. So how much is the federal government increasing their spending? So this isn't the total spending, this is their increase. And you can see that it's kind of interesting because this is a common theme. Republicans often talk about deficits and bringing down the spending of the government, but in the past 30 years, we have not seen them behaving that way. So during Reagan in the early 80s, had the largest growth in federal spending, most of that on defense. And, you know, we were in the middle of the Cold War, or at the end of the Cold War against the Soviets. You can see Reagan then brought down spending in his last 4 years. Bush increase. You know, here you have the Democrat Clinton with vastly decreasing the spending, the federal spending growth, and ended up with a surplus, actually, of a federal surplus, which is pretty amazing, of, you know, $300 billion when he handed it off to George W. Bush. Again, look at this massive increase in spending from the federal government. Again, probably because of the 2 wars combined with massive tax cuts. So again, if you're bringing less money in and you're spending money on wars, usually it works the other way. If you go to war, you got to increase taxes to pay for the war. Bush did not do that. We had wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we also gave tax cuts at the same time. So if that happens, this is just the federal spending, but if we had a graph next to it showing the debt, that would be there as well. Obama's growth in federal spending for the first 4 years, 1.4%. So here we have, again, federal spending as percent of GDP. So as a percentage of what you're producing, you can see the federal spending is 23%. Explore some ideas for why that might be happening. Federal jobs added each year. So you can see that Obama definitely was adding federal jobs to the payroll, and President Trump in his first year decreasing federal jobs, not hiring people in the agencies and laying people off. So again, we're coming to the end there. Barack, let's see your report card. You better not lie to me. And Donald, where is yours? Give them a grade.